The topic is Immigrant Voices. In today's nationalist ideas, in today's xenophobic world, when so many parts of the world are close to us and so many borders and walls are being put up, we do need to have people, we need to listen to people with different traditions, different religions, unknown social makeups, and from different physical places and divergent ideologies. We need to understand in what ways we are different and in which ways we are alike. We have to ask the question, what unites us all when our roots divide us? And to address all of those questions are two wonderfully gifted writers, Roanna Gonsalves and Rashida Murphy. Both are Indo-Australian writers. And I'm just going to read their bios. Rashida Murphy's debut work, The Historian's Daughter, was shortlisted for Scotland's Dundee International Book Prize. She teaches at Edith Cowan University in Perth, Australia. Roanna works as a lecturer in creative writing at NYU Sydney and the University of New South Wales, and is the author of Sunita D'Souza Goes to Sydney, a collection of short stories. The book won a New South Wales Premier Literary Award Multicultural Prize in 2018. Roanna is here thanks to support from the Australian Council of the Arts and the Australian High Commission in India. I want to begin today at the beginning, at the very first things we remember as human beings. For me, the very first feeling was the feeling of smell. And food is such an important component of most immigrant writing. And I'd like to find out, in fact, in Rashida's work, one of the first things that struck me was a line about the smell of a mother and the scent of sandalwood on her body. And in contrast, I remember something from Roanna's work, which was a reference to the smell of curry in her story, The Curry Muncher. And in it, I remember that the smell of curry makes her feel shame. But at the same time, I think the smell of food brings a lot of pride to someone who is an immigrant in a foreign soil, because they know that the food is something that draws the foreigner to them. So I would like Rashida to talk about the power of smell and the power of food in her writing. So why don't you talk about it? And then she's going to talk about it for just a couple of minutes and then read from her work.
Thanks, Kalpana. So I don't think I consciously set out to write a book about food nostalgia. It just crept in quite insidiously, and I guess I'm a believer in embodied forms of writing. So, give all the wise creative writing teacher told me years ago, give all the sensuous detail. So the sensuous detail in the descriptions of bodies and smells and food and was just something that happened. It wasn't a conscious decision. So
I'd love to hear you.
The piece that I've chosen, actually, just to place it in context, the book it's an immigrant story. It's called The Historian's Daughter. And the piece that I'm about to read will introduce all the main characters. So the historian is the father. He's not really a historian, but that's what the kids call him. The mother is the magician, and again, she's not really a magician, it's just what they call her. There's a couple of girls and a couple of boys. And the piece that I'm about to read is when a foreigner enters this rather strange family, and I won't say anymore, just read it. Before Saurabh came to live with us, the magician had been wary of boys in the house of women. Our brothers were allowed to have their friends in designated areas of the house. The garden room and bedroom were off limits. But one of the aunties begged the magician to let her teenage son live with a good family like ours. Farah, you don't know what mischief he gets up to in Bombay. His friends are wicked. He's a good boy and deserves a chance. Farah, we will die if you don't help. Here, in this healthy place with all this fresh air, he'll have that chance. Please let him come. I guarantee he will behave. After all, I'm a mother of girls too. The auntie wept and slapped her thighs with her hand. Sister, don't worry yourself. Of course you can ask the boy to come if you think it would help. The magician was courteous, but her eyes darted quickly towards the secret room, and she bit her lips. The boy was called Habib, with thick hair that fell across his forehead and obscured his eyes. Within days of arriving at our house of health, he was smoking with Warren, sneaking out at night with both brothers, wearing their clothes, ignoring us completely. Gloria said it was like having another brother without being able to annoy him whenever we wanted to. No advantages for us, she said. Only another smelly boy who ate too much and did too little. The historian liked him, and our brothers were spared his fists on their faces, for the months that Habib lived with us. Habib's rehabilitation involved going to college with our brothers and playing badminton on the makeshift court Clive had rigged up outside. His mother was determined that he fill his lungs with as much good air as he could before plunging him back into the evil smog and wicked distractions of Bombay. Living in Bombay means we are shortening our lives by 5 minutes every day, Habib's mother said sorrowfully. So much pollution here. I can't even tell you. Not like here. Clean and fresh. You children are so lucky. You will live long and healthy lives. Silly woman, Gloria said in my ear. I wish she'd go away and take her useless son with her. I don't like him. He stays too much. I haven't noticed. I was surprised at Gloria's tone. I don't even know what color his eyes are. All that hair on his face. You want me to accidentally trip him up? Drop a spider on him when he sleeps? You're such a criminal. No, I don't want you to do anything to him. I watched Habib carefully over the next few days and found no evidence of staring. Then he was gone, and we never saw him again. It was the magician's way of easing Saurabh into the family. It was a sort of trial. I might stop there.
Thank you. I just wanted to say how much I identified with Hannah's character in the book, in her very lovely book. I have been there with Hannah. When I was 11 years old, I was in Tanzania, Africa, and suddenly I was thrown into an environment where, by the way, I couldn't even speak English when I landed in Dar. And so I could completely relate to a character who did not only know her origins, but was trying to feel her way through her family in India, as well as in her new surrounds in Australia. So this idea of this otherness that Hannah felt, I felt, and I wanted to talk about how there's so much discomfort and displacement when you go to a country for the very first time. I felt that in Africa in 1972. When I landed there, once again I felt it in 1985 when I went to America as an immigrant. And I wanted Roanna to talk about the ideas of discomfort and displacement that is in her now.
Thanks, Kalpana. Thank you to the Australian Council for the Arts and the Australian High Commission for supporting me to come here. Thank you to the Hyderabad Literature Festival, and it's a real privilege to have someone like Kalpana as our interlocutor, and to have Rashida here on the same panel, so it's an honor. Just in terms of what it is that unites us, I think it is difference that unites us. Yeah, it is language, it is religion, it is a shared history, but actually it is being comfortable with difference that is really important, and that is what should really unite us, particularly in times like this, in this current political moment in India and in Australia. It's about being comfortable with difference, and I think fiction does that best. Stories and fiction do that best, because it invites the reader to not just empathize with characters, but also when you don't empathize with characters, to be comfortable with difference. And I think that is the role of fiction, particularly today, in storytelling today. And that's what I try to write in my book, in the stories in my book. It's published in Australia as The Permanent Resident, but in India it's published as Sunita D'Souza Goes to Sydney. And I hoped that it would be a chronicle of the lives of Indian immigrants into Australia. Because we have a long, long history of connection, geologically, socially, culturally, linguistically as well, of communities from India migrating over thousands of years into Australia, and having trade with especially the northern parts of Australia, and now a large number of immigrants. I think India's the highest number of immigrants coming into Australia are from South Asia, of which Indians are a big part. So I felt we really need to see ourselves in Australian literature. And of course I'm not the first one. Rashida also writes about Indians in Australia, and we're part of a long continuum, a long tradition of Indians and South Asians writing about our experiences. But I wanted to do something about that documented the contemporary lives of Indians at the coalface. So my book actually interrogates class within Indian communities, and it attempts to present a chronicle of the many ways you can be Indian. It's not just one way to be Indian, and also the many ways that you can be Australian. So it's not one way to be Australian. So for me, it's all about being comfortable with difference. It's easy enough to say, harder to do when someone is very different from you, has different views from you. I think that's what I was trying to do, to explore that in the book.
So do you, given that you both are Australian, do you guys touch upon the irony of having occupied a space that was originally, Australia does a wonderful job of making sure people know they are occupying what was once Aborigine country, and you see that everywhere. They remind you that this is land stolen from the Aborigines. But do you guys at all touch upon the irony of how in today's Australia, I've heard some Indians and some Chinese Australians say that they are still second-class citizens. Do you touch upon that at all?
Okay, so we are second-class citizens, but not in the way that you're thinking.
No.
Not in the way of being second to the white people there. We actually should consider ourselves second-class citizens to the indigenous people there. That's who we are second to, not anyone else. And so that's something that comes up again and again. You know, when I first left to go to Australia as an international student, my friend said, "Why do you want to go there and be a second-class citizen when you can live so comfortably here?" Of course, that was people from the Hindu majority talking to someone like me from a minority community. So this politics of difference plays out, but really that idea of second-class citizen really should be interrogated by Indians as well, and in the Australian context, because of the indigenous question. And we as Indians immigrating into Australia are very much beneficiaries of indigenous dispossession. We cannot say, oh, the white people did it, but we went there, you know, as part of an ongoing colonizing process. Of course, the things are changing, but yes, so we have to interrogate those.
Any ideas
on that? No, only to reinforce and confirm what Roanna says, because I'm very conscious that I'm in a settler colony occupying a space that was taken away from the people without them giving permission. When we do our acknowledgements of country in Australia, we always say that, we acknowledge that this is, I come from Western Australia, so it's Noongar country, and it's the land of the Whadjuk people. So acknowledging that reminds me that this country was never ceded, that Aboriginal sovereignty exists. And it is a complex and complicated relationship that immigrants have with our First Nations writers and with the settler writers, because we're all settlers. And the degree of settledness really depends on how you constantly, I guess, being constantly aware of and critiquing that space that you occupy. And as you say, it's an ongoing. I find it problematic, I find it complicated, but I know that I have to do the work. It isn't easy, it was never going to be easy, and merely acknowledging that I stand on stolen country isn't enough. We have to do more.
So I'm going to shift slightly here. I'm going to quote a British writer who said that fiction is an inch from truth, but all the art is in that inch. And I'd like you to talk about what you feel about that inch and the art in that inch, and how closely you work with your own life and the people around you in your fiction.
Okay, well, I'm actually going to respond by referring back to your session, which I attended when you were talking with Faisal. And you're both memoir writers, and you both described your processes. And I was really intrigued because I'm kind of the opposite of that. I fictionalize memoir. So I always start with something. I really did grow up in a slightly crazy family, and we really did have random people walk through the door at like any given time. I remember coming home from school as a child and finding some auntie that I knew was not related to us, and she was just sitting there. She was an auntie, and then there would be an uncle, and then there were cousins, but none of these people were actually related to us. They just became our, surrogate family. And
all of them informed you?
Yeah, so I could have chosen memoir and sort of, done a linear description, but I found it more fascinating to reflect on how I felt, to look from the child's point of view, and I'm particularly interested in, I guess, minority stories. I'm particularly interested in looking at what is not mainstream, so hence, my complicated Anglo-Iranian, Christian, something or the other family.
I'm going to give to answer the question. The same thing. How do you feel about how your fiction is influenced by the happenings in your life?
Okay, so I get asked all the time. In fact, the story I'm going to read is about this. I get asked, so is it autobiographical? And of course it's not. It is fictionalized, and that's deliberately so, because to me, fiction is a lie. It is a lie, but within that framework of the lie, as a writer, you are duty bound to tell the truth as accurately as you can. That is what the reader expects. The reader understands that it's fictionalized, it's imaginative, it is a lie, but the reader expects honesty and accuracy and truth, using language in a beautiful way on the page. So that's what I personally attempt to do.
I also would like to say that humor is a big part of immigrant writing, I think. The ability to laugh at, in any writing, I'm sure, certainly in work done by immigrants. And I would like you to read a passage from your work that demonstrates that as well.
Sure. And I think the use of satire, using the arsenal of satire, which is what I try to do, particularly in this story, is a way to invite the reader in and to have an in-joke moment, many in-joke moments with the reader, because you're saying one thing, but you mean something else. And the reader, when the reader gets that, it's just a delicious connection between the writer, the reader, and the text. So I'm going to read a short excerpt from a story called The Skit. It is a story about writing and reading a story. I won't read the whole thing, obviously, because it's quite long. I'll just read it from somewhere in the middle, but I'll just set it up for you. So in this story, I'm trying to interrogate class aspirations and the ridiculous way in which the aspiration to whiteness by certain Indians in Australia plays out. So we're in the home of Paul and Rosalind. They are Indians from Bombay, very wealthy, and they have invited some other Indians for dinner on Saturday night. And those other Indians are international students. They're much poorer than Paul and Rosalind. And one of these students who's come for the dinner, her name is Lynette, and she's an MBA student. She's not a writer, but she has secret aspirations to becoming a writer, and she's written a skit for the first time ever. She's written a skit, and she wants to read it out to everyone. So her friend has made the announcement. Her friend Sushma has just said, oh, Lynette has written a skit, let's hear it. And while all this is happening, they are waiting for this white man, Mr. Greenaway, to arrive. He hasn't arrived yet, but there's that tension in the room of someone's about to come in, he's a white man, he has power, and meanwhile, while we're waiting for him, let's get this girl to read out her skit. Oh, said Paul, turning around, a skit? You mean like a play? Didn't know we had a Salman Rushdie in Sydney. Salman Rushdie doesn't write plays, said Sanjay, another accounting student. Novels, he writes. Same thing, yaar. For any kind of writing, you have to have a good command of the language, said Paul. I always say, if you have the Queen's English, you have everything, said Rosalind. If you can write novels, you can write plays, said Paul. Salman Rushdie, if he tries to write plays, again he will make millions, again he will get a fatwa, again he will marry a model. But Polly, do you really think novels are the same as skits? Come on, let's hear it, said Sushma. She's written it, let's hear it. Lynette opened the embroidered cloth folder and lifted a few handwritten pieces of paper into the white light. Lisbeth turned down the volume and turned on the yellow house lights. Lynette nodded ever so slightly without taking her eyes off the script. She began to read. It was a dark November night. Suddenly Rosalind stood up. Lynette stopped reading. Rosalind said, "One sec, Lynette, I'll draw the curtains." When she was done, she sat down again and flicked her hand, indicating that Lynette could continue. So Lynette started again. This was the first time she had ever read her writing aloud to anyone, let alone to a whole group of people. She faltered at the start, her tongue tripping on the opening lines of dialogue. But soon she took the silence in the room for interest and was encouraged. The story was an amalgamation of many stories in the newspapers that year. A girl comes to Sydney on a student visa, attends a private college, and studies hairdressing. Like many others before her, she has been promised permanent residency or PR in Australia by her migration agent, by her private college, and by the man who stamped her visa. The fees are more than what was advertised in the brochure. When she complains to the student welfare officer, he is very sympathetic, invites her to his house, and after a glass of Riesling, begins to kiss her. She initially resists like the good woman of Hindi films and convent schools, but he is cute and keen and accurate. She succumbs to the callings of her own body and his. In the throes of passion, however, he says, "Call me Mountbatten." Then, eyes closed, he breathlessly proceeds to call her a stinking curry muncher cunt. She is stunned. She runs away immediately and decides to lodge a complaint of sexual assault and racism in the local courts. He contests the allegations, and playing on the latest cricket match-fixing scandals between India and Australia, he counter-alleges that she was attempting to buy him with sex. The story climaxes with a dramatic courtroom scene and ends with the girl being deported and the student welfare officer getting off scot-free. Lynette finished reading. There were brand new crystal glasses on the coffee table in front of Lynette. The light from the floor lamp made them glow like compliments. She asked, "So, was it okay?" There was silence. Then Rosalind said, "Oh my, that was God. You poor thing. Why didn't you tell us you were going through all this?" Lynette had imagined all kinds of feedback. For weeks she had practiced witty comebacks to questions about the dialogue, the sex scene in the story, the decision to reflect India through the broken mirrors of diasporic memory. But the assumption that the skit was autobiographical took her by surprise. No, I didn't go through any of this." Again a silence, full of pity, and a collective Catholic ache to be helpful. "Really, nothing like this happened to me, seriously." "You mean to say you made it all up? It's, what's it called, fiction or something?" "Yes," she said. "So it's not true then?" Rosalind got up and pulled the curtains back. "No." Sushma's eyes were red from the tears she was shedding freely. "Such a beautiful story. You are so brave. I mean, the girl is so brave. Poor thing." Lisbeth said, "Forget your MBA. You should take up writing. See J.K. Rowling? She's rolling in cash. What will your MBA give you? Nothing compared to that." Paul, who had not even taken one sip of his whiskey during the entire reading, now drained his glass and said, Lynette, who would have thought the little 2-year-old I saw running around in her panties in Barfiwala building in Baikala would one day write plays, like Salman Rushdie?" Sanjay inhaled sharply, but Paul ignored him and continued, "So proud of you, my girl. Didn't know that students who come here suffer like that. So terrible that she was deported." Sushma said, "Shit, yaar, what a heart-wrenching ending. Forget Hollywood. Forget Bollywood. This is heaps better. You can start in Aussiewood all by yourself." I'll stop it there, but it does get worse and worse for Lynette, who's written the script for the story.
Thank you so much, Roanna. I wanted to ask one last question of Rashida, and then we'll move to questions. I wanted to find out what she thought about how immigrant voices might evolve in the future. As the world turns and changes, what are you expecting to see?
That's a really good question. I think as the world becomes smaller, just simply because of more people from lots more places coming together and speaking and telling their stories, there is certainly room for diverse voices to grow, we, if you like, are telling our own stories. So there's a whole other intellectual debate over appropriation and who has the right to tell a story and who's listening, who's talking, those sorts of things. But I do believe that the future looks...
Is the world becoming a very generic place? So these specific stories are going to go away.
Yes, and I think as long as immigrant writers continue to do that, to privilege what they consider important instead of what they ought to be writing about. I don't do brown girl made good in white society stories. I don't see the point in that. Anyone can write that. I just choose not to. So I hope always that I'll be part of a growing group of diasporic writers who will constantly question what it means and why it means. What are the frameworks within which we are compelled to operate, and what happens when we move out of those frames and say, well, this is my story and I'm going to tell it my way. And
Anything to add, Roanna?
Just to say that the specific stories will never go away because we are storytelling creatures. As Muriel Rukeyser, the American poet, said, the universe is made of stories, not of atoms. I know maybe the scientists in the room would need some convincing about that. Happy to convince you later on. But we are a storytelling animal, really, and so those specific stories will never go away. It's just what we need to be mindful of is the centers of power that provide access for those stories to be seen and heard. So it's about access to circuits of publishing and prestige, really, that we need to ensure
giving everybody a voice,
accessible to minority stories, because that is what we are made of. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think we need to move to questions. We probably have just about 7 minutes or so. So you in the blue. And in general, people tend to give their comments for about 3 minutes before they ask a question. Question, please.
Hi, my question is not to anyone in particular, but both of you writers who want to pick your brains. My name is Rashida too, by the way. And, so right now, hi. So my India is going through this whole debate about immigrants, and I think we are very increasingly confusing a refugee with an immigrant. As a writer, if you had to ever touch that in your works, how would you differentiate between what is a refugee and what is an immigrant? Because I think they're two very different things, but we're very confused about it. That's my question.
Do the Rashidas want to have a moment?
Again, is it my story to tell, and do I want to tell it? So I wouldn't tell a refugee story per se, because I have an opinion on that. I don't think generally, I would tend to disagree that there is a confusion between who is an immigrant and who is a refugee, because it depends on the context and the country. In Australia, we are very clear about who are immigrants. Our government tells us very clearly. Our government locks up people for being refugees, which is a highly unpleasant thing. So we are under no illusions whatsoever about the status of a refugee or an immigrant. In India, of course, we could have this other debate about people being made refugees, suddenly becoming illegal because they don't subscribe to the religion that they are supposed to be, and those sorts of things. So it's fairly complex, and we could chat later.
A refugee is someone who leaves only because they have to. They are fleeing persecution. An immigrant, to me, is someone who has the choice. I had the choice to stay, but I went because I had the right paperwork. I come from the right class background that enables me to be mobile in any country, really. But for refugees, it is about fleeing persecution, and environmental refugees fleeing climate change.
The gentleman in the orange t-shirt.
My name is Ramana. I'm a physician, and I was talking to Dr. Kalpana Mohan yesterday, and refugees are potential immigrants.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
There are climate refugees, people who are escaping climate crisis. There are economic refugees. I worked with the refugees from the Central and South America, who are basically formed the migrant caravan in 2018. And I set up medical camps for these refugees.
Yes.
They're all potential immigrants.
Absolutely.
Because the law actually permits you to apply for asylum in a country which allows the process.
That's a really good point. And let's not forget that India is a country of old migrants. India is a country of migrants. It's just the migration happened thousands of years ago. Australia is a country of new migrants. But we all come from lots of different places. If you've read Tony Joseph's book, Early Indians, The Story of Our Ancestors, he provides amazing data, scientific data, of the amazing genetic diversity that exists within India, demonstrating that we're all, difference is what binds us, really.
Thank you for bringing light on those topics. But my question is, do you think the way that these things are done, through a humanitarian perspective, is it exactly the right way, or do you have any other opinion on it? Can it be done by the governments in a different way, possible, that could be less, impactful to the lives all of a sudden?
Less impactful to, you're talking about what's happening now in India?
Yeah, through a humanitarian perspective. put away, but what can be the changes that governments can take to make it a little maybe more subtle? Or do you agree with them?
Agree with the government? No, definitely not.
So whether the other way or
the Australian government. Well, first of all, they should read more fiction and more stories. And then they will perhaps, our Prime Minister actually has engaged an empathy consultant. At least he's done that. In India, it's a completely different story. But, it's about being open and not being afraid of difference. To me, that it turns on that, and being comfortable with difference and not being threatened. Not being threatened, because that's what's being whipped up, right? Presenting outsiders, so-called outsiders, as threats to current unity in whatever way, shape or form. And that doesn't even make any sense. But the PR machine is in full flow, I suppose. So.
Roanna, even our Prime Minister also has an empathy consultant. He's called something else actually.
Yes, true. Good point. They go by many names, these acolytes.
And what does the empathy consultant do?
Apparently it's not, that person hasn't really done a good job as far as I can tell.
Just to make him appear to be a little more compassionate. He looks like a he is a marketing guru, and he behaves like one. So the empathy consultant is meant to make him look a bit more human, which doesn't really happen.
Yes, I just want to say something about the Australian democracy. So we can say these things here about our Prime Minister, and we won't be locked up. And so that is, participatory democracy, which Australia is, and which it should always continue to be. And that is what India is. And so I salute utterly the women of Shaheen Bagh, the people on the streets who have everything to lose, and yet who come up and speak up when the stakes are so high for them.
Hi, thank you. My question is to either of you. Have you ever, I don't know if I can ask this question without offending anyone.
No, we have thick skins.
No, okay.
You mean in the current political context?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
So, have you ever had a heated argument perhaps, or even like a conversation in general with Caucasian people in Australia about the concept of them also being immigrants in Australia?
Yes, and they are aware of coming from elsewhere, because of course that's a whole cultural cringe, right? They pretend to be an Atlantic continent when really they're a Pacific continent, if you know what I mean. They consider themselves to be Western. A lot of that's the whole cultural cringe. They're not as good as England, and so they're constantly trying to aspire to or differentiate themselves in some way from the mother country. Of course, the mother country for indigenous people is the land that's called Australia now. And the mother country for us, you immigrants, is not England. It is India. It is Pakistan. It is China. So those things are all changing. But there is a lot of discussion, a lot of awareness. There's a long way to go, but certainly the dialogue happens. Follow Indigenous X on Twitter if you're interested. It's a Twitter handle, Indigenous X, the alphabet. They're a fantastic Twitter handle to follow where there's lots of different indigenous people who contribute. I think every month there's a different indigenous writer who writes about issues that are pertinent to indigenous communities in Australia today and across the world. So yeah, those conversations happen all the time, and there are Australians are a wonderful one. I mean, what is an Australian? It's such a complex country, just as India is. There's no one kind of Indian, right? And there's no one kind of Australian. So, but certainly, that's a good question. There are lots of these conversations happening all the time, on a kind of interpersonal level, but also in the public sphere.
So, I was wondering, who the typical audience for your books are? Is it like immigrants, or are there folks who are not immigrants who are curious about the other perspectives?
I can only answer for mine, and it's basically everyone. So there don't seem to be, you just have to be a reader to want to know something that you haven't encountered before. Roanna and I both share a publisher, so it's a small West Australian publisher. So most of our books have actually sold in Western Australia, a few in the eastern states, and Roanna lives in the east, so she's able to promote her book there. So yeah, all sorts of Australians, immigrant, indigenous, us, white.
One question. I'll just make my question very brief. I have read The Historian's Daughter. It's a beautiful work. And my one question to Rashida is this, that the historian is portrayed as a cruel person in the beginning. And towards the end, we find him becoming the mother and the father to the children. You know, once they have migrated to Australia. And somehow, as a reader, I could not just accept a person, a character. You know, I was unprepared for that. Was that your way of doing justice to that character, or did it happen like you went along with the story?
Thank you. It really depends on the reader. And I did not actually intend this rather malevolent character to be sympathetic at all. So it was never my intention to make him mother and father at the end. But if a reader gets that, I'm not going to argue with that perspective either. So no, I actually wanted, if anything, to make him slightly more sympathetic because I got so tired of his malevolence. You know, I lived with him for 4.5 years while I was writing it. I just got tired of him being horrible all the time. So I just needed him to demonstrate compassion, hire an empathy consultant, which kind of happened.